Okay, so in this lecture, we're going to do sort of an introduction to consumer behavior in the context of principles of marketing. So the book refers to consumer behavior as a black box, which I don't know if I entirely agree with that. A black box usually means you don't have any idea what's going on, so some AI systems might be a black box, or data goes in and solutions come out and you're not sure what's happening on the inside. We know a lot actually about what happens on the inside when consumers are processing marketing stimuli, so I wouldn't necessarily call it a black box. But I do think that this chart is important in that it sort of illustrates the central role of consumer behavior. So on the left-hand side, we see things like things in the environment, and then more importantly for our purposes, things that marketers are doing. So strategies and tactics and manipulating RPs and that kind of thing in order to achieve some KPI. So it could be purchase frequency, lifetime value. And in the middle of that is where consumer behavior happens. So on the front end are the tactics that we are using as marketers, on the back end are the outcomes we want, and in the middle is sort of consumer behavior and consumer psychology. So I do think, although I wouldn't classify it as a black box, I would say that I do like this graph because it illustrates the central role. All right, so there's a lot of stuff in that black box. So things about people's lives, things about psychological factors, environmental factors, and so we're just going to go through some of the highlights in this video. So I also kind of like this diagram from the book in that it highlights the idea of level of involvement. So involvement is a very important concept in consumer behavior. It essentially describes the extent to which you care or are motivated to do something. So high involvement is when you're sort of, another way of saying is highly motivated or invested, maybe. All right. So, and then also we have some sort of other cool things in here like complex buying behavior, habitual behavior, and variety seeking. So those are worth taking a look at. But let's go ahead and first jump into involvement. So when we think about involvement in a consumer psychology standpoint, we often leverage these things called dual process models. So there's a couple of them out there. You may have heard of the elaboration likelihood model and the heuristic systematic model. So basically, both of these models are more or less the same at this level, but they sort of are useful in that they show how, or kind of help us think through how consumers kind of have these two paths. And these two paths, which are this more intensive processing path versus a less intensive processing path, and the extent to which consumers are involved in a decision might dictate which path they take. So if you have something like gum that you kind of purchase on the spur of the moment, that might be a very low involvement decision. If you have a once in a lifetime vacation where you are spending months and months planning and strategizing because it's going to be a very expensive purchase and you have to get it just right, that's a very high involvement kind of purchase. So, we kind of see this marketing message or some marketing tactic gets met with either a high involvement response or a low involvement response. And, basically this diagram just generates these two paths. All right, so when we are in the high involvement situation, when we are sort of doing some deep processing, thinking about the message, the quality of the arguments, we're going to have, this sort of engaging with it in a more active way. And there's three basic flavors of that high involvement engaging. One of those might be a counter argument. So if you don't agree with the marketing message or you find something about it questionable, you might counter argue that. You might sort of debate the marketer, so to speak. The other high involvement response is a support argument. So you sort of agree with you sort of think to yourself why that argument or that message is a positive or worthwhile message. A source derogation is when you're not quite sure how to counter argue the message, but you don't want to accept that message, so instead you derogate the source of that message. So you criticize the messenger rather than the message. That's also sort of a defensive technique. So here's an example. It's kind of dated now, but this is from a commercial where a Land Rover was comparing itself to a Hyundai. So if you aren't familiar with cars, Land Rover is a very sort of high-end kind of luxury vehicle. A Hyundai would be more of a mid-market kind of vehicle. And they were saying, oh, the Hyundai is better at this and better at this and better at this and better at this and better at this. But the Land Rover does have more cup holders. And so basically they were trying to make this claim in their marketing that Hyundai was superior on lots of different things like cornering and horsepower and other things that car buyers typically care about, and only, sort of were less than Land Rover in terms of like something that seems superficial like a cup holder. And if you went to the YouTube video, you saw lots of comments underneath of people who were engaged with this message. So here's sort of a very involved kind of a critique that I just pulled off of the comments at one point. And essentially they're counter-arguing, right? Oh, Hyundai has been bad for so many years. They've had this many recalls. There's so many complaints. You are a retard, in caps. So we have a couple things going on here. Like we have counter-arguing. We have source derogation going on. Basically, this person took great offense at the idea that a Hyundai might be better than a Land Rover. Maybe they have a Land Rover. I don't know. And so they kind of engaged with that message in a very defensive information processing kind of way. All right. Now let's think about low involvement. So here is a multiple choice question that I'll give you, and you're going to get wrong. So so this is from a study that sort of demonstrates people to process things heuristically. So heuristic means we sort of use a rule of thumb that we are familiar with. So the most common one in marketing might be higher price equals higher quality. And so the Hyundai versus Land Rover example, for instance, was inconsistent with that heuristic. But here we go. If you read this about Chris being shy and withdrawn, little interest in people, meek and tidy soul, has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail, then what is Chris? An airline pilot, librarian, pro hockey player, cashier, or a physician? Most people say librarian. Sometimes people say airline pilot. No one ever says hockey player. People rarely say physician, and people almost never say cashier. But however, cashier is the right answer. So why is cashier the right answer? Well, if you think about it mathematically, there's very few airline pilots. There's even fewer pro hockey players, and not very many librarians or physicians. But cashier is actually the most common job title in the United States. And so if we were just thinking statistically speaking, given that there's like millions of cashiers, the likelihood that Chris is a cashier is much higher than that he's a pro hockey player just by odds alone. And so the thing is, people are not super fluent in thinking statistically, but we're super fluent in using these heuristics. So the thing about heuristics is that they are fast and immediately accessible and easy to use. And so we often employ them when we're in these low involvement situations, when we're not that motivated to think very hard about the answer. So here are some common heuristic biases that people exhibit. So the first might be confirmation. So we tend to look for information that confirms our pre-existing beliefs. So we're going to talk about cognitive dissonance resolution in a minute. Representativeness. So in the previous slide, Chris was very representative of our schema or our stereotype of a librarian. So even though there's very few librarians in the world relative to cashiers, we said, oh, well, that's a perfect match. Therefore, Chris must be the librarian. Availability. Availability means just like an answer is easy for us to come up with, and so we tend to easier to call to mind, so we use those answers more readily. And the last one is kind of fun: adjustment and anchoring, or anchoring and adjustment. So there's a famous study where they asked people to estimate the number of countries, African countries, that are in the United Nations. And before they let them answer, they took this big wheel, like a spinny, like prize wheel, and they went, okay, it had numbers all the way around, and they just took the wheel and they went, and they spun the wheel around and around, and it landed on a number. And they said, okay, well, your number is 3. Now, again, how many countries from Africa are in the United Nations? And what was interesting is that when people were just randomly given in this wheel that was right in front of them spinning around like a low number, they tended to guess a lower number. And when they were just randomly, quite obviously randomly given a higher number, they were also much more likely to guess a high number. So the idea is like numbers, even when they're from a very sort of random, obviously random, nonsensical source, have this ability to anchor our perceptions of something. So there's been some other ones where you have people write down their social security number before they bid on eBay, and there are people with lower social security numbers. The last 2 digits tend to bid lower. This is very helpful in negotiations. If you lowball someone on a lowball offer, they're more likely to set their reference price lower, versus when they try to highball you, they're trying to set your reference price higher. This mechanism comes into play in negotiations as well. All right, so here would be a question for you to think about. Which type of processing is this ad designed to elicit? Either heuristic or systematic processing? Any thoughts? So one idea is that it is a expensive purchase, so a Dodge minivan. This is a magazine ad, by the way. So you would think that might lead you in the direction of, oh, since it's an expensive one-time purchase that people don't make very often, they're probably going to engage in systematic processing, which could be the case. Alternatively, if you think about, there's an easy heuristic here as well, right? So there's a couple. That the Dodge Caravan is Canada's best-selling minivan. So if it's best-selling, that's a consensus cue. So consensus cue means other people have decided that that thing is good, and therefore we'll just go along with what those people think. The other one is the fact that it lists 109 reasons that it's a better minivan. So I don't really have to read the reasons to find that argument convincing. So some of the early work in these dual process models manipulated whether they served up strong or weak arguments. And they found that like when people were low involvement, like you might be when flipping through a magazine, it didn't really matter the quality of the arguments. They could be silly arguments, but as long as they were a lot of them, people used that as a heuristic, and then they made their decision based on that heuristic. So probably in this case, so you could make an argument either way. I think it would probably be an effective ad for someone flipping through a magazine. They see quickly they can see, oh, it's best selling, that's a consensus cue, and then they have this, this evidence heuristic as well. That there's a lot of evidence in favor of it. All right, moving on to the next behavioral influence, our egos. So this is going to center around the idea of cognitive dissonance. So one of the quadrants in that 2x2 we looked at earlier was dissonance reduction behaviors. So dissonance is sort of a really important mechanism, actually, and drives a lot of consumer behavior. And what cognitive dissonance is a situation where I have two conflicting thoughts. And one of those thoughts is almost always, I am a smart, capable person who makes good decisions and good things are going to happen to me. And we sort of need to maintain that cognition in order to function without being depressed. And we will go to great lengths to protect that cognition. So David Dunning refers to it as the sacrosanct self, the idea that I'm a good, capable, lovable person, that good things are going to happen to. Now, sometimes we encounter information that is inconsistent with that idea. And when that happens, that creates this dissonance effect, this sort of discomforting, sort of troubling idea that maybe we're not as good as we thought we are. And what's interesting is that in order to protect the sacrosanct self, what often happens is consumers rationalize the threatening thought away in order to protect that sacrosanct self. So Just tell you a little bit about the history of cognitive dissonance. So, it was Leon Festinger that sort of came up with this theory, and he did his PhD research studying cults, so end of the world cults. And in particular, there was this cult that was a doomsday cult. They thought spaceships were coming to destroy the Earth, and they all, what would you do? So what would you do if you truly believe spaceships, or if somebody told you spaceships were coming to destroy the Earth? Well, some people did what you might expect if that was going to happen, and they quit their job and told their boss, what they thought of them, and spent all their money, and prepared themselves to be whisked off in these spaceships prior to the destruction of the world. Right? Other people are like, I'm not so sure. Maybe I just won't. Maybe I'll just keep my job. Maybe I just won't sell my house just in case the spaceships get lost or something like that. And so they all got together in this room. They waited for the spaceships to come. Spaceships aren't coming, as you might infer. This was back in the 50s. This goes on for 24 hours, and then the leader of the cult comes in and says, through your dedication, the aliens have decided to spare the Earth. So the question is, who was more enthusiastic about the cult afterwards? Was it the people who essentially ruined their lives because of the cult and did all this, quit their job and sold their house and broke up with their wife and did all this other kind of stuff they regret? Or was it the people who kind of played it safe? And you might think, well, the people who got sort of screwed over were the ones who would be least enthusiastic about the cult. But actually it was the opposite. So because they did these things, they were most motivated to believe that the aliens were real, and they were most enthusiastic about recruiting other people to the cult and all this kind of thing. They since followed. So the idea is that there was the most conflict. Was the cult right, and the aliens really were coming, or was I just stupid, and sold all my stuff? No, I don't want to be stupid and have ruined my life for no reason, therefore I have to believe the cult is true. Whereas the people who didn't do that weren't feeling that dissonance. So they had there's some fun lab replications of that. So the bird sex one is kind of funny. They brought in students and they said, okay, you want to sign up for this class. It's going to be sort of a mature content about sex, and you're going to need to talk about it. So in order to join this class, we're going to have you read these lurid passages from the Lady Chatterley's Lover, I think it was the book. And so students had to get up in front of people and do this very embarrassing thing that was, read these kind of sex scenes from this novel, which, would be traumatic for many people. And then afterwards, some other people, they didn't have to do that. And so they just read something else, something very generic. And then everyone listened to a short recording of what the lectures were going to be like. And instead of being sort of risque kind of material, it was about bird plumage and mating rituals of birds in ornithology kind of class. And really boring in this very dry voice, and it was an awful class about bird plumage. And who was and it turns out, who do you think was the group that was most likely to actually sign up for this awful sounding course? It was the people who had to do the horrible thing, because either they did the horrible thing for no reason and the class really isn't that interesting, or the class really is worth doing that embarrassing thing that they had to do. So anytime, and researchers do other varieties of this, where essentially if you kind of make people incur some cost and then they have to rationalize that cost. And so, because we want to maintain that consistent positive self-image. A more consumer-related example, there's a story from, I think it was a book called Mistakes Were Made, about this guy who was a professor. He didn't make a ton of money, but one time he happened to be going by a dealership. He walked in and he came out with a brand new Mercedes. And this guy Nick wouldn't typically be the kind of person that would buy a brand new Mercedes, but like something just happened. He saw it. It was really cool at the dealership. He liked the test drive. He bonded with the salesperson, whatever, and he walked out with this brand new Mercedes. And then they go on to say, like, then after that, Nick can't shut up about his Mercedes. Everyone he gets the option to talk to, he says, oh, it's just a totally different experience. You know, I've never realized what driving in a car was like before I had my Mercedes. You should really get one. You know, everyone should have this level. It's really, you know, totally changes your whole commute, blah, 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 right? Goes on and on about it because Nick probably really couldn't afford the Mercedes, and so now he's trying to justify it to himself. So, moral of the story then is, like, if you want objective advice, don't ask someone who might be experiencing cognitive dissonance. Right? So if you go and ask someone who spent a lot of money on something who maybe shouldn't have, they're going to tell you it was a great decision. You have to, if you go find, you know, someone super rich like Bill Gates and he buys a Mercedes, he doesn't feel any he could buy 100 Mercedes, right? So he would, you know, be completely honest about whether or not he liked it. So if you're going to ask for advice, don't ask someone who's experiencing cognitive dissonance. If you're going to ask for a testimonial, however, you might try, like your company wants to solicit testimonials, you might want to try to find somebody for whom making that purchase was dissonance inducing, because they're going to be very motivated to convince other people it was a smart decision. And in the process, convince themselves. All right. So how is this, you know, what are some other marketing, you know, strategy or tactics that might come out of this? So here's an ad for, I believe it is a Chevy truck. Yes, so this is an ad that Chevy put out at some point, and they said, does your truck have this and this and this and better resale than Ford and Dodge? Do you have the right truck? So presumably this ad is targeted towards people who own Fords and Dodges and telling them that they bought the wrong truck and that they should instead own a Chevy. The next time they go to buy a truck, they should buy a Chevy. Do you think this would work? I would guess not. Number one, it is essentially you're attacking someone and saying they made a stupid decision about an important purchase and that they should correct that decision as soon as they can. People don't typically like to hear this. Also, this is particularly bad, you know, domain for this kind of thing because cars tend to be very closely related to our self-identity. And so essentially you're like doubling up. You are stupid. Your truck is stupid. Become a Chevy person. Stupid Ford person. And I just can't imagine this actually working. Now, this ad might work well for Chevy people because they're feeling like, oh, yeah, this Chevy's great. I made the right decision. I'm going to keep buying Chevy in the future. But if the goal of the ad is to like make people who were previously Ford and Dodge buyers, Ram buyers, move to Chevy, probably not going to work very well, I would guess. All right, moving on to the next behavioral influence, which is other people. So here's another famous study from, social psychology, the Ash Lines experiments or the conformity experiments. So what they did is they had a room filled with a bunch of Confederates. So a Confederate would be someone who works for the experimenter, typically an undergraduate student from psychology who's assisting out with the study. So they might have 10 or 12 of those people sitting in a classroom, and then one person who was actually the participant in the study would come into this room thinking that everyone there was, like themselves, a participant. And then the experimenter in a lab coat would go up to the front and they'd flash this image on the screen, and they would say, you know, which of the lines on the right is the same length as the line on the left? And they would say, is it A? And everyone would raise their hand. And the person around who was and these are all Confederates, remember. The person who was not the Confederate would look around and they would just be like, they would look at it and squint and they'd be like, I guess so, maybe? I don't know. Maybe. Everyone seems to think so. And they would end up raising their hand. And so what the moral of the story is, even when something is sort of obviously wrong, as it is here with this question, people will sort of conform to the group norms. Right? So you see, like, different subcultures, as the textbook calls them, have these different sort of rituals, and different kind of activities and different ways of dressing, different hairstyles. So we have the TikTok hairstyle that my son only recently got rid of, thank God. But you see these things being driven by, sort of this conformity kind of mechanisms. It's important to note out that there are different kinds of reference groups, though. So we mostly tend to think about associative reference groups, which is like groups I feel a part of. But there's also dissociative reference groups. So probably the goth kids would be very reluctant to listen to the same music that the preppy kids listen to, and vice versa, right? Because they don't want to be associated. Maybe there's conflict between those groups and they don't want to be associated with each other, so they avoid consuming the products that are associated with either group. There's also aspirational groups. So these are groups that we're not currently a member of, but those who a group we maybe aspire to join. So I think the classic example of this is rich people, right? So, the Kardashians, the original title of their show is Keeping Up with the Kardashians, which is a play on words of keeping up with the Joneses. And keeping up with the Joneses is an idea that, the Joneses are someone in our social group, in some sort of reference group, and they get a new lawnmower, so then we're motivated to buy a new lawnmower. They get the cool convertible car, so then we feel like we need it. Or they do go on this vacation, and we feel like we do. All right, so this is what you might call an aspiration. So rich people, unless you are ultra rich, are potentially an aspirational reference group. I will say, though, that this is also one of those areas where marketing kind of gets criticized in setting up these kind of super rich people as aspirational, because their income is so much higher than most normal people. So if you look at this chart here, this is household income. And if you extend the chart out, that's how far you have to go to get to the salary of the Kardashians. So you take this big green box, right? That's a distribution of, the bottom 98% of household income. Right? So this is skewed distribution already. But in order to get to the Kardashian ones, you have to shrink that box down and extend it so far out to get it to that point. So setting up that income in particular has the characteristic of being an exceptionally skewed variable. Something like the smartest person ever in the world would be just slightly down the line in terms of standard deviations. So anyway. So that would be an aspirational reference group. I do like to point out that there's this cool website called How Rich Am I that you can go and check out, and will tell you how rich you are compared to the global population. And interestingly, most college students, when they're graduating, they think about what their starting salaries are at, and they're already in the top 10% globally, just as their starting salary out of college, because there's massive amounts of poor people in the world. And so in America, graduates of college getting those the kind of salaries you get when you graduate from top 30 university, you're already in the top 10% of income earners in the whole world. So I noticed on this slide Elizabeth Holmes is actually on the world's richest people in 2015, and I think it is this week that she starts her prison sentence for frauding investors. So that's kind of a fun coincidence I noticed on my old slides. And let's see. I just want to mention that it's better for your sort of life satisfaction to engage in downward rather than upward social comparison. So if I'm looking at the Kardashians and trying to keep up with them, that's not the best way to be happy. The better way to be happy is looking downward and thinking how much better off you are than unfortunate people in many other parts of the world. So thought I would point that out. I mentioned this before, but so when you think about it, marketing at the sort of market level finds these opportunities to sell stuff. And if I'm making millions and millions of dollars a year, I have the opportunity to buy different stuff. And so the market interest just comes up with weird stuff to sell to rich people. So you have this example, on the one on the far right, this guy he's wearing a shirt made of solid gold thread that weighs 80 pounds, and he wears it around so he can look rich, right? I can imagine it's got to be uncomfortable. It's a pain. You got to have someone button it for you, but it makes you look rich, and you can buy a multi-million-dollar shirt and wear it around. I guess fun, right? The other one that's a little on the left-hand side is this thing called civet coffee. And civet coffee, if you're not familiar, is coffee that's made from coffee beans that have been pooped out by a weasel-type character from Southeast Asia. And so they take this weasel and they feed it coffee beans, and they dig the coffee beans out of the poop, and they roast it up and sell it for $600 a pound. And the consensus is it doesn't actually taste any better, but it's just this story you can tell about eating weasel poop coffee is worth, $600 a pound versus $6 a pound for regular coffee. The more recent one, I was watching Billions last season, I guess, and the people were putting $1,000 caviar on their pizza and saying to themselves, remember when we didn't even like caviar? And now we can't eat a pizza without smearing raw fish eggs all over it. So, culture marketers produce things and people train themselves to like things in weird ways. And hopefully, I don't know. Lately I've just been thinking about this interplay between marketing and society and income distribution. And marketing is looking at these opportunities to sell stuff and inventing, weird stuff for rich people to buy, like yachts with their girlfriend's face carved in it, or weasel poop coffee, or ridiculously uncomfortable shirts, or fishy tasting pizza, so that are just expensive and acquired tastes, I guess. But at the same time, in order to do that, then you have other people that sort of aspire to this stuff. And so, again, we've talked a little bit about in previous lectures, where marketing gets critiqued. And in developing opportunities for rich people to spend money, they create these opportunities to engage in upward social comparison that makes people less satisfied with their life. Rarely is it beneficial for companies to say, hey, look at all these people that have less than you. Shouldn't you be happy with your life? Because you don't sell things typically that way. But it's useful for you personally to do that because it makes you more grateful and satisfied with what you have. All right. Moving on. Let's think about individual differences in personality. So there's this quote from the book, which I found sort of a little surprising, but actually not surprising. In consumer behavior, chapters in most marketing textbooks tend to leverage stereotypes at a really uncomfortable level. And so in this one, they're saying people who identify as female, on the other hand, tend to make decisions at a more emotional level. And so that sort of, thinking is just sort of lazy. There are people who think emotionally. There are people who are very rational. It's an actual individual difference that was sort of popularized by Barry Schwartz, called maximizers versus satisficers. And women can be and maximizer essentially is someone who would agree with statements like this: no matter how happy I am with X, I'm always on the lookout for better opportunities. Whenever I'm trying to pick a movie, I'm always making sure I do the optimal one. I never settle for second best. These are the kind of behaviors of somebody who does not making emotional decisions, who's very involved in purchase decisions and sort of rationally processing everything to a fault, really. And so relying on these sort of stereotypes is not really the best way to move forward and predict consumer behavior. So, all right, moving on. Personality. So if you haven't heard of the big 5 personality characteristics, Here they are. They're conscientiousness, agreeableness, neuroticism, openness to experience, and extroversion. And there's some evidence